Just a case of the chickens coming home to roost.
For years, we've been fed lines like, be the change you want to see. Practice what you preach. You can't change the world without changing yourself. These are quotes we accept, we repeat, we teach them. They all say the same thing. Change is collective and it starts with us. But here's where the maths stop mathsing. At the very same time, we've been told a completely different idea that the societal dysfunction, the upheaval and crime that we see in society is caused by only a small fraction of people. Just a few bad actors, just a few bad communities, just a few bad individuals. So which one is it? Is change something we're all responsible for? Or is dysfunction something only they are responsible for? Because both ideas cannot be true at the same time. There is a contradiction. A blatant contradiction sitting in plain sight that we refuse to name. An elephant in the room that we keep walking around pretending that it isn't there. I've tried, more than once, to point to it quietly, to be subtle about it and careful. But I've come to realize that sometimes you can't soften the truth and expect it to land. At some point, you have to stop tiptoeing and start telling it exactly as it is. That means asking harder questions, uncomfortable questions, questions that go beyond surface behavior and into the deeper currents. Because if we keep treating crime as something that only happens out there, something only they do, we'll keep missing what's actually driving it. It's like focusing on the echo whilst disregarding the sound that produced it. Are the problems we're facing today really about crime or about a culture that quietly promotes criminal behavior long before the law ever gets involved? I remember when I wanted to get my driver's permit. Mind you, this was almost 40 years ago. My father paid a driving instructor from the neighborhood, Mr. Tam, for me to get driving lessons. He was a licensed instructor, and we did everything by the book. Mr. Tam told me to remind my father to give me $300 when I have to do my driving test. I initially thought this was a payment we had to make at the licensing department, so I asked the obvious question, where do I pay that? The answer was simple. You don't pay it anywhere. Just discreetly give that to the licensing officer, the driving license examiner. That was it. I did exactly that. The officer took the money, put it in his pocket, and I passed the test. It wasn't described as corruption. It wasn't framed as a bribe. It was treated as a normal operating procedure, and that's when the lesson landed. No one had to explain it to me because the system demonstrated it. Yes, rules exist, but consequences are selective. Yes, morality exists, but only when it can be enforced. If it isn't illegal, it's acceptable. And even when it is, once it cannot be proven, it doesn't count. He who alleges must prove, and proving costs more than most people can afford. What I learned that day as a teenager had nothing to do with driving. I learned how authority behaves when it isn't being watched. I learned how power moves quietly. I learned how systems trained people without ever announcing the lesson. That wasn't crime to me back then. That was orientation. And once you see that, you start noticing it everywhere. Files don't move unless there's an incentive. Jobs don't come simply based on what you know. But who? Problems don't exist unless they become public, and even then, only long enough to be managed. You learn what to say. More importantly, you learn what not to say. You learn when to stay quiet. You learn who is protected. You learn who is expendable. Not because anyone lectured you, but because the outcomes are consistent. This is how behavior is shaped, not through values, through repetition. Silence gets rewarded, exposure gets punished, compliance gets labeled professionalism. And slowly, without ceremony, a different moral code takes hold. Not, is this right, but can this be challenged? Not, is this wrong, but can this be proven? That question doesn't belong to criminals. It belongs to societies that have learned how to survive themselves. You know, there's an old biblical account that understood this long before modern systems ever did. In Genesis, we know the story of Abraham. Abraham bargaining with God over the fate of the city of Sodom. It wasn't over laws. It wasn't over punishment. It was over numbers. 50 righteous people, then 45, then 40, then 30, then 20, then 10. Each time, the question is the same. If there are enough people doing what is right, can the city be spared? And the answer was yes. The city didn't need to be perfect, it just needed enough people holding the line. But they couldn't even find 5. Not 5 criminals, but 5 righteous persons, which tells us something uncomfortable. Sodom wasn't destroyed because wrongdoing existed. It was destroyed because there wasn't enough people holding the line. And when that absence becomes normal, you don't have a crime problem. You have a foundation problem. So now we have to ask it plainly. Are we dealing with crime or are we dealing with culture? Because crime by definition is an act or omission punishable by law. It's something you can point to, charge, prosecute, sentence. Culture, however, is different. Culture is what teaches people what's acceptable long before the law ever shows up. Culture decides what gets excused, what gets ignored, what gets normalized. Culture teaches you when to stay quiet, who to protect, who to sacrifice, what can be done, and what will never be touched. Crime is visible. Culture, however, is inherited. Crime is punished selectively. Culture is practiced collectively. And if we're honest, long before guns enter the picture, long before gangs form, long before violence erupts, the culture has already spoken. It has already taught us lessons. It has already set its thresholds. It has already decided who consequences apply to and who they don't. So when we point at crime without interrogating culture, we're treating symptoms while protecting the condition. And that's why the cycle keeps repeating. Because you can arrest behavior, but you cannot police a culture that refuses to examine itself. In 2010, while still serving as a police officer in Trinidad and Tobago, I had already come to a hard conclusion. What we were facing wasn't just a crime problem, it was a cultural one. We could arrest more people, we could increase patrols, we could run operations, seize weapons, flood communities with enforcement, and still, the same patterns keep regenerating because we were dealing with behavior downstream, which is the result of something much deeper upstream. That's when I began pushing an initiative called Change Our World. It was not a crime-fighting campaign, not a policing tactic, but a cultural intervention. The focus wasn't punishment, it was consciousness, responsibility, values, how people relate to power, authority, and each other. Because you don't change outcomes without changing the environment that keeps producing them. That initiative never gained the traction it needed, not because the problem didn't exist, but because cultural conversations are uncomfortable. They don't allow easy blame. They don't let responsibility stay out there. They force institutions and citizens alike to look inward, and systems built to manage symptoms rarely welcome questions about foundation and essence. Now, here's where the conversation gets really uncomfortable. Because once you stop pretending crime is something that only lives on the street, you start seeing the same logic everywhere else. See if you can recognize the similarities. The gang extorts a community for protection. The institution withholds access unless conditions are met. Institutions don't extort with violence. They decide who qualifies, who waits, who goes without. The gang enforces silence. Don't talk or there will be consequences. The organization enforces silence. Don't expose this or your career is finished. The gang recruits the vulnerable. The system exploits the desperate. The gang launders money whilst institutions sanitize misconduct. The gang protects its own. The institution closes rank. Different uniform, same logic. One does it with a gun, the other does it with paperwork, with policy and procedure, but the operating principle is identical. At this point, it's hard not to think of George Orwell's classic Animal Farm. Not because it's a story about animals, but because it's a story about power. The problem in Animal Farm wasn't that the farmer fell, it's that the logic of the farm never changed. Those who rose up to correct injustice slowly adopted the same behavior they once condemned. Same control, same exemptions, same justifications, dressed up as necessity. until eventually no one could tell who the farm was really for anymore. Power without accountability, protection without transparency, control without correction. And this is where the lie collapses, because when society points to the street and says, look how immoral they are, but refuses to interrogate the same behavior when it wears a suit, when it carries a title or sits behind a desk, that's not morality. That's selective outrage, and the street sees it. Young people aren't confused. They're not ignorant. They're observant. They watch who gets punished quickly and who gets protected endlessly. They watch how justice moves fast downwards and stalls upwards. They learn the real lesson early. Rules are not about right and wrong. They're about who you are and where you stand. So when the same society turns around and asks, why don't these youths respect the law? The answer is simple and devastating. Because the law didn't respect itself first. And this is why crime keeps mutating. Because crime is not the root. Culture is. And until the culture is honest about itself, all we are doing is rotating symptoms and calling it progress. You cannot condemn behavior that mirrors your own conduct at different level of power. You cannot correct sin from a position that refuses correction. And you cannot restore order in a society where accountability is optional for those who write the rules. That's not lawlessness. That's moral asymmetry. As I outline this, I hear my deceased mother's voice saying, pot calling kettle bottom black. Societies don't collapse because criminal exists. They collapse because there aren't enough people holding the line, especially at the top. And when those who are supposed to hold the line are insulated from scrutiny, shielded from consequence and immune to correction, crime doesn't look like rebellion anymore. It looks like imitation. Listen, when you strip everything back, what keeps this entire structure standing isn't just greed, it's fear. Fear is what turns good people quiet. Fear is what turns silence into policy. Fear is what keeps everyone playing their part while pretending they had no choice. Fear of losing a job. Fear of being transferred. Fear of being isolated, blacklisted, blackballed. Fear of being labeled difficult. Fear of not eating tomorrow. Fear of becoming the example. So people adapt. They don't lie outright. They just don't tell the whole truth. They don't commit the act. They just look the other way. They don't pull the trigger. They just sign the paper, approve the file, close the case, delay the action, and slowly, fear gets rebranded. It becomes being realistic. It becomes being professional. It becomes knowing how things work. And this is how fear disguises itself as wisdom. And guess what? The street feels this too. A young man doesn't join a gang because he loves violence. He joins because fear has already taught him that protection only exists in numbers. Fear of being unprotected. Fear of being a nobody. Fear of being disposable. So whether it's a suit or a block, the calculation is the same. Where am I safest? Who has my back? What happens if I stand alone? That's not criminal thinking. That's human survival under pressure. So when we talk about the lost generation, we need to be honest about which generation was actually lost. It wasn't the ones who picked up the guns. It wasn't the ones who joined gangs. It wasn't the ones who broke the law loudly. The real lost generation was the one that learned early how to obey without understanding, how to comply without questioning, how to call fear discipline and silence maturity. They were trained to fit into systems that never helped design, to respect authority that refused to be accountable, to survive by staying quiet and call that wisdom. And then, years later, they turn around and ask why the youth don't believe in the same rules. But belief doesn't survive hypocrisy, and legitimacy doesn't survive exemption. You cannot teach integrity in a culture that rewards compromise. You cannot demand lawfulness from people who only see law enforced selectively. You cannot correct sin from a position that refuses correction. That's the contradiction we've been avoiding. We say, be the change, but we outsource responsibility. We say, practice what you preach, but we protect power from scrutiny. We say, change starts with us, but we decide who us really includes. And the culture notices, the street notices. So when crime mutates, when it finds new forms, new methods, new faces, that's not innovation. That's adaptation, because behavior will always follow the logic that the culture rewards. And if the culture rewards fear, silence, and selective accountability, then crime isn't an anomaly, it's alignment. So let's stop pretending this is just a policing issue, or a youth issue, or a poverty issue. This is a foundation issue. This is a culture issue, a question of whether there are still enough people willing to hold the line, not privately, not symbolically, but publicly and consistently, because history has already answered this for us. Societies don't collapse because wrongdoing exists. They collapse when righteousness goes quiet. So the real question isn't how do we fight crime? The real question is, what kind of culture are we reproducing and who is finally willing to be examined within it? That's the conversation we've been avoiding. And until we have it honestly, everything else is theater and performance. Usually, I end with a 5-point directive, a way forward. But I'm not doing that today, because this doesn't require a directive. What this requires is honesty. It requires a society willing to look at itself without excuses, without scapegoats, without pretending the problem lives somewhere else. There's no checklist for this. Either enough of us are willing to hold the line publicly, consistently, and without exception, or we aren't. And history is very clear about what happens when the answer is no. So, what are the choice you are about to make? This is a sacred curriculum. Lesson complete. Now, remember who you are.